Hello, everybody. My name is Benjamin Schurz with Hill for Literacy, and I am delighted to welcome you to another segment of our webinar series. Today, we have the fortune of being with Deborah Reid. And Deborah taught for 10 years. Before she was a researcher, she taught at San Diego and San Antonio schools, where she worked with high needs populations. And that really informed her research and her dedication to literacy. And we are so excited to have you here today, Deborah, to share your work with us, your understanding of the needs of teachers and leaders, especially with statewide implementations. And Deborah is the director of the Tennessee Reading Research Center at the University of Tennessee. And today we're going to be hearing about the research that she has done with statewide teacher training reading programs and the impact that has on students. Just a few housekeeping items. There is a Q&A feature that we have. So as you listen to the presentation, as you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A, and we'll have an opportunity to talk about your questions after her presentation. Again, just something about Hill for Literacy. We work with schools at the state, district, and school level to support implementation and structured literacy support. We also work with schools to analyze data and use data effectively so you can make sure that you are meeting the needs of all of your students and your teachers so that they're informed and confident with how to use their materials. So with that, we're really excited to hear Deborah's presentation. And how teacher training supports outcomes. Deborah, take it away.
Thank you, Ben, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm excited to have this opportunity. Hill for Literacy has such a great reputation, so it's a pleasure to be here with you. So as Ben mentioned, we'll be talking about statewide teacher training, which is all the rage these days, and the impact that it has on students and their reading proficiency in the early grades, which are the primary targets of such legislation. Just as a reminder, we are an independent evaluator, meaning that we are at arm's length from the work itself. So we're not involved in preparing the professional development. We're not involved in delivering the professional development. We do not work for a state department of education. We are completely independent so that we can support the veracity of our findings and really provide as much information as possible to the states that we work for and to others so that they can learn from it as well. So as I mentioned, there are many states that are adopting legislation related to the science of reading, or what I refer to as scientifically based reading research. At the time that we were preparing the report of these findings, there were at least 32 states that were requiring training for in-service teachers. That increases every year, and legislatures across the country are in session right now. And so who knows, we could be approaching close to 50 states by the end of these sessions. But it is definitely a growing number of states, and they all have a lot of similarities in what they are requiring around how teachers need to approach reading, what they need to know about reading, and the kinds of things that should and should not be happening in classrooms. The trainings themselves are quite costly. In most cases, there are vendors involved, and so there are big investments in the training. In one study, an examination of what was spent in just 36 states over an 18-month period was, it's very small on my screen, $660 million that was spent, and that's just an 18-month period. Most of these trainings are ongoing and continue, so there are continuous investments being made. And so you can see that there is a financial cost associated with this that should pay off. There are financial costs of kids not being good readers as well. So we'd like to think that this investment up front, although costly, can prevent other kinds of costs later on. However, there haven't been a lot of robust evaluations of the implementation of these trainings at scale or statewide. The kinds of examinations that have been done typically have focused on teacher knowledge and not so much on the links to student outcomes. So we were very interested in bridging that gap and getting beyond just teacher knowledge, but to the actual outcomes of interest when training is written into legislation, which is that students will improve in their reading abilities. When we look at existing research on the outcomes associated with professional development, again, we see a lot of information that suggests that teachers' knowledge improves pre versus post participation in the training. And this is often based on what we learned from studies conducted by researchers on some training that they're doing, but also applies to studies conducted on statewide implementation of reading training as well. What we see less often is an association with growth in students' reading skills. It's quite inconsistent. And these are almost entirely from studies conducted by researchers on things that were directed by researchers. So again, we don't really know what happens when it's implemented statewide, but even when researchers maintain a high degree of control and involvement in the training, we sometimes see student improvements and sometimes not. We tend to see more student improvements in lower grade levels with constrained skills, for example, but just not widespread guarantees of improvements in student outcomes. So there is a gap to address and some question as to the utility of the trainings being provided, especially as we increase the implementation from outside of just what can be controlled in one research study to what is implemented statewide in all districts or required of all teachers. So we're going to talk through the conditions in one state that had a certain set of parameters for the required training in their legislation. This may sound similar to your state, but it may also sound very different. We have found that the required amount of training varies widely across states. Some require as many as 80 or 90 hours of training versus having maybe just a few hours of training. So in this particular state, it's somewhere in the middle, around 30 hours of required training. And in this state, the training was delivered asynchronously. So teachers could log on and self-pace their learning. It was very knowledge-based. It was front-loading teacher knowledge on the science of reading and everything that goes into reading development. And they had to pass a summative test on it with an 80% or better rate, or they could retake the test or revisit the modules until they accomplished that 80% or better score on the post-test. So at 30 hours, this is approximately a week's worth of training in a typical 6-hour day of viewing the modules. In addition to that component that would become required eventually in the state legislation, there was an optional additional 30 hours of training that at the time was delivered in person, and it was held in sessions in the summer. It was very application-based, so taking all of that front-loading of knowledge from the first course and figuring out how to apply it with their high-quality instructional materials to plan lessons, look at data, etc. In that case, because it was an in-person training, there was a summative performance task involved with some lesson preparation. We refer to it in the state as intellectual preparation. The plan itself is already available within the teacher materials for the high-quality instructional materials. So this is the step further of really thinking through all the pieces of delivery and the appropriateness for students based on their data. So again, in the legislation, the first component of 30 hours of knowledge-based would become required. It was not at the time of the evaluations I'll be talking about today. And the second piece would forevermore remain optional and would be more application-based. So here, this slide provides a basic outline of the course content from the required piece that is on the left side of your screen and the optional piece that is on the right side of the screen. They somewhat mirror each other in that the same sorts of principles are involved in both of the courses. But again, the left side is just very knowledge-based, whereas what you'll see threaded throughout on the right side is that application to the use of high quality instructional materials for actually putting that knowledge into practice in the classroom. It's very aligned with the idea of scientifically based reading research. So the implementation of this legislation occurred gradually over a number of years. In the first year, and this will be the first study with outcomes that I'll report, it was optional at that time for all teachers to participate in it. The teachers knew that a couple years down the road, it was going to become required, but at the time, they still didn't have to have it. So these were more motivated people to participate and get going with this. And we conducted the evaluation after that first year of implementation, which would have been completing the asynchronous course during the school year and then finishing, if they continued on to course 2, finishing that in the summer before the next school year started again. We focused only on the K-1 students in that evaluation because those kids were entering school at that time and getting the right kinds of instruction, hopefully, from the start, as opposed to looking at kids in the later grades who, regardless of the availability of the statewide training, they could not have benefited from that. They're much further along. They would be past these initial stages of reading development. So it would be much harder for us to detect an impact of that statewide training. So we focused on K-1. The legislation also had a particular priority on students who were not reading proficiently. And in that state, it was defined as scoring at the 40th percentile rank or below on the Universal Reading Screener. So we were looking only at those kids in year 1 who were the impetus for the legislation and the highest priority targets for improving teacher instruction in reading. In year 2, the course is still optional, but we're a little bit further down the road in getting it implemented. We see a higher rate of voluntary still participation. So we expanded the student population to include all students, not just those who were identified as being at risk of reading difficulties, but all kids. And then we broke down the performance categories and examined that separately, which I'll show you in just a moment. And we are currently involved in the year 3 outcome evaluation, where now the course is required. So we no longer have a group of teachers that can be considered a control group that aren't getting any training at all. They're either getting this training that's provided by the state, or they have to have permission to replace it with some other training. So the evaluation is going to shift dramatically with what we're doing now with year 3. So we're only reporting on year 1 and year 2 at this time. Our research questions were the same in both years, but the population of students again changed. So the primary research question was basically, when we compare it to the teachers who didn't participate in the statewide training at all, how did their students do relative to the students of the teachers who did participate in the training? And in year 1, again, I want to remind you that that concerned only the students who were considered at risk of reading difficulties, whereas in year 2, we looked at all students. The second research question then directly compared the course 1 that would become required based on legislation to teachers who progressed on and did the additional 30 hours of training for 60 hours total by having course 1 and course 2. So the first research question examines no training to any training, and the second research question addresses the required training versus additional training beyond the required training. Again, we have that difference in the populations, year 1 being at risk of reading difficulties only, and year 2 being everybody. So we have 3 possible groups based on the teachers who participated in the training. So again, they're either in this none control group, meaning they didn't participate in any training, or they're in the ERT1 group for course 1, what would become required, or they're in the group that's ERT1 plus 2. They completed the required and the additional training for 60 hours total. Then we associated all of those teachers with their students. So they were the teachers of record for certain groups of kids, and we included those children's outcomes in the analyses. Our year one participants are shown here. We have columns for kindergarten and for first grade, as well as the overall totals. Within kindergarten, first grade, and the totals, you see the breakdown of teachers and their associated students. One thing to point out on this slide is that we see a pretty big group of teachers and students in the non-control group and a pretty big group in the ERT 1+2 group. So there are fewer teachers who are just doing that, what would become the minimum required. There's a clustering, a heavier clustering in the non and the ERT 1+2. Still have healthy sample sizes in there, but just something to make note of, that it is a smaller group in course one. Because we have differences not only by teacher training, but also by what school you're in and what community and in what district, we had to consider all of these other potential influences on student outcomes and do a statistical procedure where we propensity score weighted kids to match them on demographics as well as school characteristics, and then consider their nesting within teacher, within school, within district. So lots of stats involved in order to control for other potential confounds here. We won't quiz you on that at the end of the presentation. So here are the participants from year two. This is a bigger table because remember, we have first the full sample, all kids in K1, and then we break it down to those who were the ones at risk of reading difficulty by scoring at or below the 40th percentile on the Universal Reading Screener versus the kids who were scoring above the 40th percentile, who were considered to be meeting proficiency benchmarks. So everybody's in the top group, then some of the kids are in the middle group, and some of the kids are in the bottom group. We did 3 separate sets of analyses. And again, we did all the statistical controls to reduce the confounds. One thing of interest in this state is that there are 7 approved universal reading screeners. And initially, the state thought we could just put all 7 together and analyze all of those kids. Well, what this slide shows you is that the score of interest to the state that was required by legislation is this basic reading composite. But when you look across the 7 URS vendors, the subtests that make up this basic reading composite vary widely. And so we can't really say that one screener is exactly the same as the other screener just because they produce this percentile rank called a basic reading composite. And so in conversation with the state, I will say they were very receptive to this, to our concerns about this. We showed them some preliminary analyses that suggested it was not wise for us to combine them all. And they were very agreeable. They wanted an answer that they could really stand behind. And the other thing I will say is they provided financial support for one universal reading screener. They did not provide financial support for the other 6. So we focused just on the one that they provide the financial support for. So we reduced the 7 URS vendors down to 1. And as I mentioned earlier, we considered the nesting of students within teachers, within schools, within districts. So all of those other potential confounds that we wanted to control for based on their clustering. These tables of statistics, you don't have to know how to read all of this very well. I'm just going to tell you that whether we were looking at the non-control group to getting the minimum training or the non-control group getting the minimum plus the additional 30 hours of training, it was always better to get training. So some or more training was better than none training. And that meant that students of teachers who were participating in course 1 or course 1+2 were consistently, statistically, significantly outperforming the students of teachers who were not participating in the training at all. And this, I think, is a great celebration because, again, we have very little available in the existing literature to establish that these kinds of investments in statewide training pay off ultimately in what we're hoping to accomplish, which is improve student outcomes. And here we found it. So that's very exciting for us. Then when we did the direct comparison of getting the minimum training versus getting minimum plus, the additional components of training, we did not see statistically significant differences. So getting a little or a lot did not matter, just getting any training at all in the scientifically based reading research and what that means for what to do for instruction, any of that training was helpful over getting none. But getting additional training in that, at least in year one, didn't give an added boost to student scores. So interesting findings related to this first part of the study was that, first of all, it's consistent with some research that says there's a point of diminishing returns with professional development. So in that Bosma and Savage study I cite there on the slide, they found statistically significant effects up to 30 hours of professional development, but that started, you didn't get additional boost. That started to kind of decline a little bit when you went beyond 30 hours. So that is what we found, which was good for the legislators to see that what they were requiring with 30 hours was the right dosage. However, that course two is not just more knowledge, it's application. And we typically think that an application piece is necessary, that knowledge alone isn't sufficient unless you know how to put it into practice. So it was actually quite surprising that we did not see the additional boost of course two, but it was delivered in the summer at the time when teachers didn't have immediate access to students to put what they were preparing immediately into place. So that potentially could have limited it. And the other thing was, it was the first year. Everybody was a new learner. The teachers were new to this, the students were new to the kinds of instruction. So there may just be a lag time involved. That maybe it wasn't, teachers weren't ready, no one was really ready for the additional component yet. So that's why we explored that a little bit more in year two. Remember, we also expanded out and looked at a broader range of students. So rather than showing you all those individual tables of results, because it's quite complex with 3 different kinds of analyses happening, we just have this nice summary table for you to get the overall picture of what was significant and what wasn't. In general, you can see a lot of green on this image, which means we had a lot of statistically significantly positive results for training. So that's very encouraging again, that given the very few evaluations that have been done, that we're seeing a payoff of this investment in statewide training. And we saw it not just for the kids who were most in need, but we saw statistically significant results for the kids who were reading proficiently as well. We saw it when the whole class was together. So you have almost straight greens down that full sample column for both kindergarten and first grade. The only place where we didn't see a difference was when we did that direct comparison of course 1 to course 1 plus 2 in kinder only. We did not see a statistically significant difference, just like we didn't in year 1, but you'll notice when we went to grade 1, we did. So as the students got a little bit older, got a little bit further in their reading development, that additional training was beneficial to them. For the kids who were at risk of reading difficulties, course 1 in kindergarten remained the most beneficial, but by first grade, again, we see that the addition of course 2 is very important. So further reinforcement that as kids progress in their development, even when they are still not reading proficiently, that additional training that teachers receive in how to apply what they've learned to their instruction is helpful in grade 1. And for kids who were already reading proficiently in kinder, that course 2 again gave an added boost. And that was the reason that the difference what existed between the none training and the course 1 plus 2. There really was a strong boost there. And that carried over into first grade as well. Course one alone was not significant in grade one for either the students who were still trying to get to proficiency or for the students who were above the proficiency benchmark. It required course two in order for both groups to really get the benefit from it. So very interesting results that tell us that there is some benefit to having this kind of distributed practice, giving kids more time to experience this instruction, teachers more time to get acquainted with it, and familiar with how to apply that knowledge that they learned in course one to what they're doing in their classrooms through what they gained in course two. And students, as they progress and get better and are accessing on grade level text more, teachers need to have a broader range of knowledge. So those are the basic conclusions that we have after the second year of the evaluation. As a reminder, as this implementation progresses, for the year three, we're no longer going to have a control group. All teachers, as of the fall of year three, were required to have completed at least course one. So now our examinations will turn to focusing on the difference between course one to course one plus two. So we'll have another opportunity to revisit that idea that additional training can benefit teachers, especially as kids progress. We also think that there might be some shift that occurs as kids move up the grade levels. We started with these early cohorts so that we weren't getting residuals from perhaps instruction that wasn't fully aligned to what we hoped and what the training would advise. So we didn't include older students in these first two rounds of analyses, but those kids are now moving up. So we really want to see where they end up as they get into grades 3, 4, and 5, and they're now taking the state assessment, not just the universal reading screener. So we're interested in following them and also looking at whether those foundational literacy skills that are taught early have a carryover effect into what happens when foundational skills become less of the emphasis in reading instruction, and reading comprehension, meaning-based instruction takes over more of the time in grades 3, 4, and 5. It's not a complete forgetting of the foundational in grades 3, 4, and 5. I do want to emphasize that, especially for kids who are having some difficulties, but the emphasis in core instruction makes a shift in those upper elementary grade levels. We also are aware that the assessments change frequently. So they're computer-based, and vendors are constantly making updates to improve the assessments, and we're not always aware of any slight differences that might have, but we have a really big difference coming in this state where we're conducting the evaluations because the state-sponsored universal reading screener was renormed over the summer. And so things are changing drastically. So we're going to see it a lot more clearly than we normally would when they make small changes that we're not necessarily fully aware of. And again, that shift to the state assessment might make a difference in the results because what is assessed on a universal reading screener is not the same as what is assessed by the state on their summative measure. That is just as instruction shifts in emphasis, the state assessment shifts the emphasis more to meaning-based skills, and those are standards aligned. And so we expect that we will see a difference in the results as we look at the different measure as well. So I think I stuck relatively close to our time. We're at 4 o'clock Eastern for me, so we're at the time for questions.
Well, thank you, Deborah. Very exciting for us as a professional development organization that has really prided ourselves on translating the research into action. Right? So many times teachers receive research and the knowledge, and then we get the questions, what do we do with that knowledge? And so that second tier of application training, clearly it's important. It makes a big difference. And we do have a couple questions that came in, and then I have a few questions also. So our first question Do any states require observations and coaching with alignment to the content and the deliberate practice learning experiences afforded during the training?
This is a great question. So, the state where we're conducting the evaluations right now does have an observation, like a walkthrough tool that they use. However, and we tried very hard to include that in the evaluation. But the problem is it is inconsistently applied. We cannot say that the way one team, the tool is the same, but we cannot say that the way that one team in one school applies that tool when they're doing their walkthroughs is exactly the same as the way another team in another school applies that tool when they do their walkthroughs. So we weren't sure that we really could place a lot of confidence in the data that we were gathering from that because there's no effort to calibrate across the whole state. Calibration is done perhaps within district, maybe. Maybe it's just within school with the team that is responsible for doing these walkthroughs, like the coach, the assistant principal, and the principal, perhaps, but maybe not beyond that. And so it just becomes really tricky to include that. So this is a yes, but answer to Phyllis's question that it is required. How do we include that in the evaluation and what difference that's making remains a little bit elusive to us.
All right. And Phyllis has another great question. What does the research suggest when the administrators receive training in structured literacy and science in practice?
Yeah, so what the literature does say is that leadership matters in schools. We have a manuscript under review right now for middle school implementation, and leadership in middle schools is needs a lot of help. So we know really consistently across studies of implementation that leadership does matter. And it's hard to provide strong leadership when you don't know what you're looking for, you don't know what the target is. And so even though there are perhaps a lack of really concrete findings that connect leadership knowledge and experience to what happens in the classroom, the further you get away from the kids, the harder it is to say, yes, it's because of the leader. So it gets harder to trace back that far. But what we do know is that leadership affects implementation, and implementation is linked to student outcomes. Where we have weak implementation, we have weaker outcomes. So there is research that establishes that, and there is research that establishes the importance of leadership. What we don't really have are hard numbers on how much of an impact does an individual leader have, or how much knowledge do they need to have before they can really hit that mark of being a strong leader.
Great. So here's another question, and I'm curious about this because I was talking with a district recently about turnover, and I'm wondering if any data came out about the impact of teacher training on turnover, right? The amount of teachers that turn over, and also if there was any impact or data, or you captured anything about new teachers that are coming in to a system where this training is established, and how that might impact student outcomes if there is that kind of robust training system.
Yeah, you raise a really good question about the retention of teachers, especially during this time period where we've experienced high turnover coming off of school disruptions from COVID, et cetera. I do not know of any research that has linked this kind of reading training to teacher retention or to teacher turnover and outcomes from that. But it does give me reason to go back to the state and say, hey, can we get some of the data on that and find out what's happening across the year? So maybe I can come back to you and let you know if we're able to do that part of the evaluation. So thanks for that suggestion.
All right.
I can tell you that I was involved in an earlier series of reading training in the early 2000s, and there was a huge statewide investment in getting all these teachers trained in elementary school. And what they found just 3 years later was that so many teachers had left that all that training was gone.
Mm,
So they, at the time, we didn't have perpetual access to training online or anything like that. So it was either you participated in face-to-face training or you didn't. And then if you did and you left the profession, you took all that with you, and there was nothing for the people who came in behind you or who remained. So I think that's why a lot of states have gone to something that's virtually based, so that they can continuously train and retrain as teachers come in. In this particular state, the legislation stands that everyone has to have the training. So whether you're a new teacher, a teacher who moves in from out of state, an alternatively trained teacher, we have job embedded programs, we have the gamut. Everybody has to get the training or get approval for some other equivalent form of training. So we're seeing a lot more of that in state legislation as well. I gave you the count of states that require in-service training. That number remains higher than the states that are putting a laser focus on what's happening in pre-service training. But there is a healthy number of states, and growing. Again, we're in the midst of legislative sessions, so maybe there will be even more. But there are more states looking at how teachers are prepared and what the expectations are. We're in like the second wave of literacy standards for pre-service candidates in the state that I'm in, and I've only been here 4 years. So those are constantly being examined and updated, and documents have to be provided. I will also say that although there are some flawed processes that people have pointed out about things like NCTQ's evaluation of teacher prep programs, it really has shined a spotlight on some gaps in the preparation of educators for delivering high quality literacy instruction. And hopefully people are approaching that legitimately and not just figuring out how to outsmart the paperwork that you submit for those kinds of things. But we really hope that it's making an impact on the preparation of teachers so that we can get them going from the beginning the right way, and then work on that ongoing professional development to continue to strengthen them.
fabulous. It's so encouraging, really, to know that we are starting to address the need of teachers from the beginning and that teacher preparation. And then, when they're in the profession, we don't have to play catch up so much, right? We're not catching up to the current research or the new knowledge, that teachers are coming into the field with that. And then we can just keep elevating. So thank you so much. That's all for the questions. I do want to just tag a few things for takeaways that I heard today. One being leadership matters, right? That a weak implementation equals weak outcomes. And so that if we can define systemic implementation and features of effective implementation and having that consistently across grade levels, across a district, then we will see positive student outcomes and the effect on that. And the other, of course, is that training matters, right? And that while there was this kind of cap on how many hours of training impacted in the first year, that in that second year, the continued training, the training and the applications really made a significant difference on student outcomes, especially in first grade, and especially for those students that are struggling and trying to close that gap. And so those were the takeaways that I really found. And then your hopes for the future, right? And that it is going to impact as assessments become more meaning based. That's something that we need to track and that we want to lean into and look at. And so those were some of the takeaways that I got today. I hope lots of people had some other ones that were meaningful and powerful for you. And I always try and end with a final question, Deborah. What gives you, as you do your research, as you're spending time in schools, leaning into your experience as a teacher yourself, what gives you the most hope about what's happening in education right now and where you see things headed?
Well, there are two things I want to say about that. First is the other really big takeaway I hope people get from the research is that no children were harmed by this training. And I think the counter argument is often that you're focused only on the kids who aren't reading proficiently and you're holding back our kids who are coming into school doing better. Nobody was harmed. We didn't have statistically significantly negative effects. So there's nothing that's bad about what we're doing. Even the kids who are excelling are doing just fine with the increased attention on more code-based skills in the early grades. And we don't know the extent to which not giving them that in the early grades just because they're doing better at that time doesn't have this down the stream effect, when they're older. So I think that's a really important and encouraging message as well. And the other thing I will say is that the idea of teaching as a profession is something that I think comes out to me strongly in what I see in these state evaluations, that it is treated more like professional work that requires nurturing, it requires vigilance, it requires collaboration with your colleagues and constant refinement. I remember when I was in the classroom and people would do walkthroughs, I'd get a note in my box at the end of the day that told me how many kids had their shirts untucked and how many were chewing gum. That is not the kind of feedback that teachers are
Yeah.
getting from walkthroughs now. They are getting very substantive feedback. They're having very meaningful conversations about what is happening with teaching and learning with kids. And that gives me an enormous sense of pride that the profession of teaching is being taken much more seriously. And that everyone involved in it is invested in that. So I think there's more good things to come just from that.
Fabulous. All right. Well, thank you so much. I learned a lot from your presentation, and I share your hope for the future. I think there's more great things to come, and we are delighted to be in it as a company that is supporting districts nationwide. And thank you, because your research and the work that you do is work that we rely on, and being able to share that with districts and leaders and teachers to help them understand the power of scientifically based reading research, science of reading, and structured literacy, and how important that is and the impact it has on their students and families. We know that reading is a gateway skill, and that for students that struggle with reading, the impacts go far beyond challenges in school, that it ends up in challenges in life. And so, having the data that shows the more our teachers know, the more they understand not only the theory, the knowledge, but what to do with that knowledge, the better outcomes we have with our students. So, thank you so much, Deborah. I appreciate all the work that you do.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we are delighted. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Again, my name is Benjamin Schurz. I am with the Hill for Literacy. You can tap the QR code. You can visit us at hillforliteracy.org on the web and view our resources and what we have and ways that we can support you in schools. Please reach out, feel free, and I would love to chat with you and learn more about what you're doing in your districts. Have a great day.